The grand conclave of the Galactic Accord sat in the shape of a massive ring, floating in the cold dark around a pale blue star called Ethira Prime. And inside its walls, 312 species had gathered to decide the fate of worlds they would never visit and peoples they would never understand. Ambassador Renata Ochoa stood at the lowest tier of the chamber, where humanity had always been placed, looking up at rows and rows of alien faces that glowed and shifted and breathed in ways she had spent her entire career learning to read. And today, every single one of those faces told her the same thing. Something was wrong. She had come expecting routine business, the standard renewal of Earth's provisional membership that happened every few years like clockwork, a formality wrapped in ceremony that usually took no longer than an afternoon. But when she opened her agenda briefing that morning, she found the schedule had been changed overnight, and a new item had been added at the top of the list, stamped with the golden seal of the upper council. Resolution 1187, the formal expulsion of Sol 3 from the Galactic Accord. Renata read it twice, and then a third time because her mind refused to accept the words, and then she sat down slowly in her chair and stared at the cold metal floor beneath her feet and breathed until her hands stopped shaking. The Thyrasi hegemony had introduced the resolution, which surprised no one who understood galactic politics, because the Thyrasi were the oldest and most powerful bloc in the Accord, and they had never liked humanity, not from the very first day 97 years ago when a clumsy human FTL jump had startled their allies the Velith, and set off a chain of panic signals across half a sector. Elder Vorithek of the Thyrasi rose to speak, and the chamber fell into perfect silence because when a Thyrasi elder spoke you listened or you suffered, and his voice came out low and smooth like stones grinding under deep water. He listed the charges one by one, in that terrible patient way of his. Humanity had expanded into 3 contested star systems without proper authorization, he said, and humanity had refused to undergo genetic tempering of their aggression instincts as recommended by the Biological Standards Committee, and humanity had developed weapons that carried what he called extinction-class philosophies, and then he paused and let the silence stretch before he delivered the final blow. The incident at Reth Anora. Every species in the chamber knew the story, or at least the version of it that had spread through the galactic news networks, how a human peacekeeping unit during a pirate suppression operation had improvised a gravitational slingshot weapon out of a broken freighter's drive core, and in the process, accidentally destabilized a small moon's orbit, sending it drifting 3 degrees off its axis and triggering tidal chaos on the inhabited world below. What the news networks did not report was that the human unit had done this to save 11,000 Lorathi civilians trapped on a transport that the pirates were using as a shield, and that without the improvised weapon, those 11,000 people would have died, and that the moon's orbit was corrected within 6 days by a combined engineering team that included the very same humans who had knocked it loose. But Vorithek did not mention any of that. He spoke for 40 minutes, and when he finished, he simply said that the Accord could no longer afford the risk of keeping such an unstable species within its borders, and then he called for others to second the motion. Renata watched them rise one by one, species after species standing to add their voice to the chorus of rejection, and she could see the pattern clearly because she was human and humans were very good at seeing patterns even when they did not want to. Some of them were genuinely afraid, the smaller herbivore species who flinched at loud noises and had never understood why humans laughed when they were nervous or fought harder when they were wounded. And Renata could not blame them for their fear because fear was honest even when it was wrong. But others rose not out of fear but out of obligation, because the Thyrasi controlled trade routes and resource allocations and defense pacts, and when the Thyrasi wanted something done the price of saying no was far higher than the price of saying yes. And so they stood and they seconded the motion, and they did not meet Renata's eyes as they did it. The Velith delegation rose to second, and Renata felt that one like a knife, because the Velith were the first species humanity had ever made contact with, the first alien faces human eyes had ever seen. And for a while, there had been something close to friendship between the two peoples. But friendship meant nothing when the Thyrasi held your trade licenses in their claws. The vote was called. Renata stood perfectly still as the numbers climbed on the display above the chamber floor, watching the count rise like a tide she could not stop. 227 in favor of expulsion. 84 against. 1 abstention. It was done. The chamber erupted in murmurs and whispers and the clicking sounds that passed for nervous conversation among the insectoid species, and somewhere in the upper tiers, a Dren delegate was arguing with a Thyrasi attaché in sharp hissing tones. And in the middle of it, all Renata Ochoa stood completely still and completely silent. She thought about the scientists back on Earth 97 years ago who had cried when they first received the Galactic Accord's welcome transmission, the way they had hugged each other and laughed, and wept because humanity was not alone in the universe. And she thought about every human who had gone out into the stars, since then carrying that same desperate hope that maybe this time they would find a place where they belonged. A Thyrasi official approached her with a datapad containing the formal expulsion order and the terms of withdrawal, 30 standard days to remove all human presence from Accord space, all treaties void, all trade agreements cancelled, all joint operations terminated. Renata took the datapad and read it and handed it back. The official asked if she wished to make a statement for the record. She looked up at the chamber, at 312 species, who had just decided that humanity was too dangerous and too strange and too young to sit among them, and she felt something settle inside her chest, not anger and not grief, but something quieter and harder and far more patient. She said 5 words into the silence. "You will hear from us." And then she turned and walked out of the grand conclave of the Galactic Accord with her back straight and her head high and her hands steady at her sides. And she did not look back, not once, because Renata Ochoa was human and humans had been walking away from closed doors since the beginning of their history, and they had never once failed to find another way through. Behind her, the chamber buzzed with confusion because they had expected tears or threats or desperate bargaining, because that was what every other expelled species had done in the long history of the Accord. But the human had simply walked away as if she already knew something they did not. And the truth was she did not know anything yet, not really. But she knew her people and she knew what they were capable of when the universe told them no. And that knowledge was enough to keep her walking with steady feet through the long, cold corridor that led away from everything humanity had spent a century trying to build. 30 days, she thought. 30 days was more than enough. The news reached Earth at 11 minutes past midnight Universal Standard Time, and by sunrise, every human world from Mars to the furthest colony on Kepler-7 knew that the galaxy had thrown them out. The reaction came fast and loud at first, the way human reactions always did, with protests in the streets of Geneva and angry broadcasts from military commanders who wanted to show the Accord exactly what human weapons could do, and economists screaming about the collapse of interstellar trade and politicians pointing fingers at each other, because that was what politicians did when the ground shifted under their feet. But then something strange happened. The anger burned hot for 3 days and then it went quiet. Not the quiet of defeat, but the quiet of a billion minds turning inward and thinking hard. And within a week the streets were empty, and the broadcasts had stopped, and the politicians had gone behind closed doors, and the galaxy watched its sensors and listened to its communication channels, and heard nothing from the direction of Sol. Nothing at all. Inside the chambers of the United Terran Commonwealth, the arguments raged in private. Generals slamming their fists on tables and diplomats pleading for emergency appeals and trade ministers calculating the cost of losing access to alien markets. And it was into this chaos that Dr. Kalen Mwangi walked with a single data tablet, an idea so strange that the room fell silent just trying to understand it. Mwangi was a game theorist, a man who had spent his entire life studying how intelligent beings made decisions under pressure, and he had spent the 3 days of silence running the numbers on every possible response humanity could make, from war to begging to simply accepting the expulsion and retreating into their own corner of the galaxy. War would fail, he told them, because the Accord had numbers and technology and the weight of 10,000 years of established infrastructure behind them. Begging would fail because it would confirm every belief the Thyresi had spread about humanity, being emotional and unstable and unworthy of respect. And simply accepting defeat would mean abandoning every human who had spent their career building bridges between species, every doctor and engineer and trader and peacekeeper who had poured their lives into making the galaxy a little bit better. So Mwangi proposed something else entirely, something he called the doctrine of demonstrated value. The idea was simple enough for a child to understand and terrifying enough to make every general in the room go pale. Humanity would comply with the expulsion completely and totally, and without a single word of complaint, and in doing so, they would tear a hole in the fabric of galactic civilization so large that every species in the Accord would feel the cold wind blowing through it. The Commonwealth Council voted and the doctrine passed by a narrow margin, and the order went out to every human in Accord space. Come home, all of you, and do it with grace. On the border world of Keth 4, Dr. Sana Reyes received the withdrawal order while standing in the middle of a Velith medical ward with her arms buried up to the elbows, in a nutrient bath that held 37 fertilized Velith eggs. The eggs were dying. A fungal plague had swept through the Velith breeding chambers 3 weeks earlier, something their own doctors had never seen before, a mutation that attacked the calcium shells and turned them soft and porous. And one by one, the eggs had begun to collapse inward like paper lanterns in the rain. Sana had figured out the treatment through sheer stubborn refusal to let anything die on her watch. A combination of human antifungal compounds modified with Velith-compatible proteins that she had invented in her tiny lab using equipment held together with tape and hope. And for 3 weeks, she had been injecting every surviving egg by hand because the Velith medical machines were not calibrated for the precision the treatment required. She had saved 214 eggs so far. When the withdrawal order came, she stood very still for a long time, and then she went back to work, because she had 8 days left before the deadline and there were still 37 eggs in the bath, and she was not going to leave until every single one of them had a chance. She worked for 7 days straight, sleeping in 3-hour intervals on the floor of the ward, and on the 7th day she injected the last egg and watched its shell begin to harden, and she allowed herself to cry just once quietly, where no one could see. Then she wrote down everything she knew about the treatment, every formula and every dosage and every observation she had made, and she handed the file to the Velith chief medical officer, a tall, quiet being named Seelith who had watched Sana work with an expression that Velith faces were not supposed to be able to make. Seelith took the file and held it against their chest and said nothing because there was nothing to say. Sana packed her bag and walked to the shuttle port, and she did not look back at the ward where 214 eggs sat in their baths, growing stronger by the hour because a human woman had refused to sleep. On the Joint Species Station, Nimbus Deep, Chief Engineer Tamaz Herrera was having a different kind of farewell. Tamaz had been maintaining the station's atmospheric processors for 12 years, a job that no one else wanted because the processors were old and temperamental, and built from a design that combined technology from 6 different species in ways that made no logical sense. And the only reason they worked at all was because Tamaz had spent a decade learning their moods the way a farmer learns the moods of weather. He had tried to write a manual, a complete guide to keeping the processors running, But every time he sat down to explain what he did, he found that the knowledge lived in his hands and his instincts more than in his words. The way he could hear a subtle change in the hum of the CO2 scrubbers that meant a cascade failure was building 6 hours before any sensor would detect it. Or the way he knew that the nitrogen valves on Deck 7 needed to be opened exactly 1/4 turn past their recommended setting during the station's orbital periapsis, because the thermal expansion from the nearby star changed the pressure dynamics in ways the original designers had never accounted for. He left the manual anyway, 200 pages of his best attempt to translate intuition into instruction, and he shook hands with every member of his engineering team, 4 Dren, 2 Makhati, and 1 very old Lorathi who had worked beside him for 9 years, and who pressed their antennae against his forehead in a gesture of respect that Lorathi usually reserved for their own elders. Tamaz walked to his shuttle with his toolbox in one hand and his manual in the other, and he thought about the processors humming away behind him, and he hoped that someone would hear them the way he did. In the diplomatic quarter of the Accord's administrative hub, a young human attaché named Priya Bakshi was doing something that looked like nothing but meant everything. She had spent the last 20 days compiling a record, pulling data from every archive and database she could access before her credentials were revoked, building a document that no one had ever thought to build before because no one had ever thought it was necessary. It was a list of every single thing humanity had done for the Galactic Accord in 97 years. Every emergency medical intervention, every engineering repair, every trade dispute mediated, every pirate attack repelled, every famine averted, every refugee convoy escorted, every improvised solution to a problem that no other species had been willing to touch. 1.4 million entries. She compressed the file and encrypted it, and on the 29th day she passed it quietly to a Lorathi delegate named Ambassador Chithel, who took it with trembling forelimbs and hid it in the folds of their ceremonial robe. "Why give this to me?" Chithel asked in their soft clicking voice. Priya smiled the way humans smiled when they were sad and sure at the same time, and she said, "Because you will know what to do with it when the time comes." On the 30th day, the last human ship crossed the border of Accord space, and the communication channels went dark and the galaxy held its breath and waited for whatever came next. But from the direction of Sol, there was only silence. And in that silence, the first cracks began to form. 6 months after the humans left, the galaxy began to understand what it had done to itself. And the understanding came not in a single terrible moment, but in a slow, grinding accumulation of small disasters that built upon each other like stones stacking on a scale, until the weight became impossible to ignore. It started on Keth 4. The fungal plague came back, just as Dr. Sana Reyes had feared it might, because the mutation was adaptive and relentless, and it had already begun changing into something new by the time the Velith medical teams tried to use her treatment protocols. And the formulas she had left behind were precise and detailed, but they had been written for a human mind that could improvise when variables shifted. A mind that could look at a dying egg and feel in its gut that the dosage needed to change, even before the numbers confirmed it. The Velith doctors followed the protocols exactly as written, and at first the treatment worked. But when the fungus mutated for the 3rd time, they did not know how to adapt because adaptation was not something their medical tradition valued. Their tradition valued precision and repetition, and the careful application of proven methods. And proven methods were useless against something that had never existed before. 30,000 eggs were lost in a single week. Chief Medical Officer Seelith stood in the empty breeding ward and held the data file that Sana had given them and read it again for the 100th time. Searching for something they had missed, some hidden instruction that would tell them what to do now. And for the first time in their long and distinguished career, Seelith wished desperately for a human, not for their technology or their medicine, But for that strange and frightening ability, they had to look at a problem that had no solution and simply refuse to accept that fact until a solution appeared. On Nimbus Deep, the atmospheric processors failed on a Tuesday. It did not happen all at once. It happened the way Tomás Herrera had always feared it would, a subtle shift in the harmonic frequency of the CO2 scrubbers on Deck 7 that went unnoticed for 11 hours because no one on the engineering team could hear it. And by the time the sensors finally caught the anomaly, the cascade had already begun. The Dren engineers opened Tomás's manual and found the section on cascade failures, and followed every instruction to the letter. But the manual said to listen for a specific change in pitch that would indicate the cascade's progression, and none of them knew what that pitch sounded like, because Tomás had never been able to describe it in words. It was a thing he felt in his chest the way a musician feels a wrong note, and without that feeling the instructions were just marks on a page. 3 species evacuated Nimbus Deep in the first week, and by the end of the month the station was running at minimal capacity, with half its decks sealed off, and its atmospheric mix slowly drifting toward compositions that would eventually make the remaining sections uninhabitable. The Accord sent a team of their best engineers, and those engineers looked at the processors, and looked at the manual, and looked at each other and quietly admitted that the system had been held together for 12 years by one man's intuition, and without that man, they would need to rebuild the entire atmospheric network from scratch, a project that would take 3 years and cost more than the station was worth. In the outer trade lanes the pirates grew bold. The Wreath Corridor clans had always been a problem, but they had been a manageable problem because the human peacekeeping units assigned to the region had possessed something that no amount of military doctrine could teach: the ability to think like criminals, to predict unpredictable behavior by simply imagining what they would do if they were desperate and clever, and had nothing to lose. The Accord's replacement forces were disciplined and well-equipped, and utterly incapable of dealing with enemies who did not follow rules, because every species in the Accord had evolved within social structures that rewarded predictability and pattern following. And when the pirates changed tactics mid-battle or set traps that made no logical sense or attacked targets that had no strategic value just to create confusion, the Accord forces responded by consulting their tactical databases and finding no matching scenarios and freezing in the critical seconds between recognition and action. Trade losses tripled in 4 months, and insurance rates for interstellar cargo climbed so high that smaller species began pulling their merchant fleets out of the affected regions entirely, and the economic ripple spread outward through the Accord like cracks in ice. But the worst damage was the quietest. The Lorathi and the Kreth had been on the edge of conflict for decades, 2 species with psychologies so incompatible that direct communication between them almost always ended in misunderstanding and rage. And for 30 years the only thing that had kept them from war was the presence of human trade intermediaries who could somehow speak to both sides without triggering the instinctive hostility responses that each species provoked in the other. No one had ever quite understood how the humans did it, this strange gift for standing between incompatible minds and translating not just words but intentions and emotions and the subtle unspoken currents that ran beneath every conversation. And no one had thought to ask because it had always just been there, like gravity, invisible and essential, and completely taken for granted. Without the human intermediaries, the Lorathi-Kreth trade negotiations collapsed in 11 days, and by the end of the month, both species had recalled their ambassadors and begun positioning warships along their shared border. And the Accord's diplomatic corps scrambled to intervene, but they could not find anyone capable of doing what the humans had done because no other species in the galaxy possessed that particular combination of empathy and stubbornness and emotional resilience that allowed a person to sit between 2 enemies and simply refuse to let them destroy each other. Elder Vorithek of the Thyrasi addressed the conclave and dismissed all of it as adjustment pains, temporary disruptions that would smooth themselves out once the accord adapted to the absence of such an unpredictable element. And his voice was calm and certain, and his words were carefully chosen, and not a single being in the chamber believed him. Behind the closed doors of the Thyrasi Hegemony's Intelligence Bureau, the analysts were running projections that painted a picture so alarming that 3 senior officers requested immediate retirement, rather than be the ones to present it to the Elder Council. Humanity had not been a minor member species, occupying a minor seat in the lowest tier of the conclave. Humanity had been the connective tissue of the entire galactic accord. And now that tissue was gone, and the body was beginning to tear itself apart. It was Ambassador Chithel of the Lorathi who made the first move. Chithel had carried Priya Bakshi's data file for 6 months, reading it at night in the privacy of their quarters, going through the entries one by one with the patient thoroughness that was the Lorathi way. And what they found in those 1.4 million records changed everything they thought they knew about the species that the Accord had thrown away. The numbers were staggering and undeniable. Humanity had been involved in 43% of all cross-species emergency responses in the last century. They had mediated 61% of trade disputes involving 3 or more parties. They had contributed to 29% of all engineering innovations registered with the Accord in the last 50 years. And they had done all of this while holding less than 0.3% of the political power in the conclave. Chithel began sharing the file, quietly and carefully, passing copies to delegates they trusted from species who had reason to listen, the Velith who had lost their eggs, the Dren who had lost their station, the Makati who had lost their trade routes, the dozens of small and mid-tier species who had always sat in the back of the conclave and watched the powerful make decisions that shaped their lives without ever being asked for their opinion. One by one they read the file, and one by one they understood. And they began to gather in quiet rooms and speak in careful whispers, and they gave themselves a name that carried the weight of everything they had learned. They called themselves the Remembered, because someone had to remember what the galaxy had chosen to forget. 11 months after the expulsion, the formal petition arrived at the Grand Conclave bearing the signatures of 89 species, each one stamped with the authority of their highest governing bodies, and it demanded an emergency session to revisit Resolution 1187 under Article 9 of the Accord Charter. Article 9 was so old that most delegates had to look it up, buried deep in the founding documents from an era when the original architects of the Accord had still believed in fairness. And it said in plain language that any resolution affecting the membership status of a species could be challenged if 1/4 of the Accord's members formally requested a review. 89 species was more than 1/4, and Elder Vorithek knew it the moment the petition landed on his desk. And for the first time in his very long life, his hands trembled, not with fear, but with the cold recognition that he had miscalculated something fundamental. He tried to block it through procedural challenges, arguing that Article 9 required a waiting period of 5 years, but the text said no such thing, and the conclave's legal scholars confirmed it within hours, and he tried to discredit the petition by claiming that the smaller species had been manipulated by human agents operating in secret. But Ambassador Chithel of the Lorathi stood before the chamber and stated calmly that no human had contacted any member of the Remembered since the expulsion, and that the petition was born entirely from the lived experience of species who had discovered what the galaxy looked like without humanity in it. The emergency session was scheduled, and the invitation was sent to Earth. On the other side of the border, Ambassador Renata Ochoa received the transmission in her office in Geneva, where she had spent 11 months watching the galaxy fall apart from a distance and waiting with the kind of patience that only a human could sustain, the kind that looked like stillness on the outside but burned like a furnace on the inside. She accepted the invitation, But she attached a condition that made the Commonwealth Council argue for 2 full days before they agreed to it. She would not come to beg for readmission. She would come to propose new terms. The galaxy expected humanity to arrive desperate and grateful, stumbling back through the door with their heads bowed and their hands out, ready to accept whatever scraps of membership the Accord was willing to offer. But humanity had not spent 11 months sitting in the dark feeling sorry for itself. Humanity had spent 11 months building. Dr. Kalen Mwangi had understood from the beginning that the doctrine of demonstrated value had 2 phases. The first was the withdrawal that would show the galaxy what it had lost, and the second was the transformation that would show the galaxy what humanity could become when it stopped waiting for permission. The engineers went first. Thousands of the brightest minds Earth had ever produced gathering in orbital shipyards and research stations across the Sol system to solve problems that had been put off for decades, because the Accord's technology had always been available as a crutch. Within 3 months, they had developed a micro-FTL communication relay network that was smaller and faster, and more energy efficient than anything the Accord used, built from principles that human physicists had theorized about for years, but never pursued because the Accord's existing infrastructure had made it unnecessary. Within 6 months, the biologists had cracked synthetic protein cultivation, using methods that the Thyrasi had deliberately kept secret for centuries to maintain their agricultural monopoly. And the human version was not just equivalent but better, capable of being tuned to the nutritional requirements of over 200 known species, with nothing more than a simple software adjustment. Within 9 months, the shipwrights had designed and built a new class of vessel called the Adaptive Series, modular ships that could be completely refitted for any mission profile in under 6 hours, from medical frigate to cargo hauler to deep space explorer, using a system of interchangeable components that snapped together like the building blocks human children played with, elegant in their simplicity and devastating in their implications. The message was clear to anyone who cared to read it. Humanity did not need the Galactic Accord. Humanity had never needed the Galactic Accord. They had stayed for 97 years not because they had to, but because they wanted to. Because humans were a species that looked up at the stars and felt lonely and reached out toward every light they could see. And they had poured themselves into the Accord not out of dependence, but out of a hope so stubborn and so deep that it had survived 97 years of being treated as lesser. And now that hope had been tested, and it had not broken but it had changed shape, hardened into something that looked less like longing and more like resolve. Renata Ochoa boarded the TCS Perspective on a cold Tuesday morning, a ship built entirely by human hands using human technology, sleek and silver and humming with quiet power. And as it lifted away from Earth, she looked down at the blue-green world below and thought about all the people who had built this moment with their work, and their patience, and their refusal to accept that closed doors stay closed. The Perspective crossed into Accord space, and every sensor network in the region lit up because this was a human ship, and human ships had not been seen in these lanes for almost a year. And the Accord Border Patrol hailed them and asked for their identification, and their docking protocols, and Renata's communications officer responded with the emergency session invitation code, and the Border Patrol went silent for a very long time before clearing them through. When the Perspective reached HFY Prime, it did not dock at the visitor berths where human ships had always been directed, the lowest and furthest berths on the station, the ones that required a 30-minute shuttle ride to reach the conclave chamber. Instead, Renata ordered the ship to approach the main diplomatic docking ring, the one reserved for full member species. And when the station's traffic control informed her that human vessels were not authorized to use those berths, she replied that the Perspective did not use Accord standard docking systems and could not interface with the visitor berths. This was true, but it was also deliberate because the Perspective's engineers had designed the ship's docking array to be incompatible with the old berths and compatible only with the main ring. And when the station's engineers protested that the main ring could not accept a non-standard ship, the Perspective's crew built an adaptive docking interface in 6 hours and transmitted the specifications to the station, and the station's engineers looked at the specs and looked at each other and connected the ship without another word because the engineering was flawless. Renata walked through the main diplomatic corridor for the first time in her career, the wide, bright hallway that she had only ever seen from a distance, and she kept her pace steady and her expression calm even though her heart was hammering so hard she could feel it in her teeth. The conclave chamber was full in a way it had not been full in living memory, every seat taken, and the galleries packed with observers from species that usually did not bother attending sessions, and the air hummed with the sound of 312 different forms of nervous anticipation. The Thyresi block sat in their elevated seats with faces like carved stone, and Elder Vorithek watched Renata enter from below with eyes that gave away nothing. Ambassador Chithel sat with the remembered 89 delegations arranged in a block that took up nearly a third of the chamber, and when Renata passed their section, Chithel inclined their antennae in a gesture of greeting that made the Thyresi delegates shift uncomfortably in their seats. Renata took the speaking floor and looked up at the assembled galaxy, and she did not speak for a long moment, letting the silence build until it pressed against the walls. Then she reached into her coat and produced a small device and pressed a button, and the chamber's holographic display activated and filled the air with an image that was 97 years old. It showed a room on Earth, a laboratory filled with equipment and screens, and in the center of the room a group of human scientists were clustered around a communication terminal, and they were crying, every single one of them, tears running down their faces as they listened to the first transmission from the Galactic Accord, the message that told humanity it was not alone in the universe. They were crying and laughing and holding each other, and some of them had fallen to their knees, and one woman in the back of the room had her hands pressed over her mouth, and her eyes were wide with a joy so enormous it looked almost like pain. The recording played for 30 seconds, and then Renata stopped it, and the chamber was so quiet that you could hear the station's atmospheric processors humming through the walls. She looked up at the assembled species and she spoke, and her voice was steady and clear, and it carried to every corner of that vast room. "We came to you with open hands," she said. "You taught us that open hands can be stepped on, so we learned to build with them instead." She paused and looked directly at Elder Vorithek, and then she looked at Chithel, and then she looked at all of them, every species, every delegate, every face in that enormous chamber. "Now we would like to talk about what together actually means." And in the silence that followed, even Vorithek could feel that something in the galaxy had shifted, something fundamental and irreversible. Because the humans had come back, but they had not come back the same. Ambassador Renata Ochoa stood on the speaking floor of the Grand Conclave and presented humanity's proposal to 312 species, who had never in 10,000 years of galactic civilization been asked to imagine that things could be different. She did not call it a request, and she did not call it a demand. She called it the Ethira Compact, and she laid it out in language so plain and so clear that no translator could twist it, and no lawyer could bury it, and no politician could pretend they did not understand. The first provision said that no species would hold permanent seats on the upper council ever again, that all council positions would rotate based on a contribution index that measured what each species actually did for the Accord rather than how old they were or how many warships they had, and that this index would be transparent and publicly accessible, and reviewed every 10 standard years, so that no one could hide behind ancient prestige while doing nothing to earn it. The second provision said that the expulsion of any member species would require a 90% supermajority, and a mandatory independent review conducted by a panel drawn from species with no political or economic ties to the accused, so that never again could a single powerful bloc use backroom deals and trade threats to cast out a people whose only crime was being young and different. The third provision said that a new body would be created within the Accord called the Interspecies Advocacy Council, composed entirely of representatives from the 50 smallest and youngest member species, and that this body would hold genuine veto power over any resolution that affected provisional members, because the ones who best understood what it meant to be overlooked were the ones who should hold the power to prevent it. The fourth provision was the one that made Elder Vorithek's scales flush dark with fury. It said that contribution would be formally recognized as a form of sovereignty, that any species which demonstrably sustained galactic infrastructure and peace and cooperation would earn protections that could not be overridden by bloc politics or ancient hierarchies, protections written into the Charter itself, and enforceable by the full weight of Accord law. It was a complete dismantling of everything the Thyresi hegemony had spent millennia building, a surgical removal of the levers of power that had allowed a handful of old species to control the lives of hundreds of younger ones, and Renata presented it not with anger or triumph, but with the calm certainty of someone who had done the math and knew the numbers were on her side. The chamber erupted. Vorithek rose from his elevated seat, and his voice cut through the noise like a blade, and he called the Aethira Compact an insult to every species that had built the Accord from nothing, an attack on the very foundations of galactic order, a reckless gamble proposed by a species that had not even mastered interstellar travel when the Thyresi were already charting the far reaches of the galaxy. He spoke of tradition, and he spoke of stability, and he spoke of the wisdom that came from age, and he reminded the chamber that the Accord had functioned for 10,000 years under the current system, and he asked why anyone would risk destroying what worked for the sake of a species that had been a member for less than a century. When he finished, there was a moment of silence, and then Ambassador Chithel of the Lorathi rose from their seat among the remembered. Chithel was small even by Lorathi standards, an insectid being barely a meter tall with delicate translucent wings folded against their back and forelimbs that trembled slightly when they were nervous, and they had never spoken before the full conclave in their entire career, because the Lorathi were a quiet people who preferred to listen rather than speak. But today Chithel spoke, and their soft clicking voice carried through the chamber's amplification system and reached every ear and every audio receptor in the room. They did not argue with Vorithek's points, and they did not defend humanity's record, and they did not cite the statistics from Priya Bakshi's data file, even though they knew every number by heart. Instead, they opened the file to its very last entry, a record that Priya had added on her final day in Accord space, and they read it aloud. It was the communication log from a human cargo pilot named Marcus Webb, who had been escorting a Lorathi colony ship through the Reth corridor 3 weeks before the expulsion vote, when a pirate flotilla had dropped out of FTL on an intercept course. 6 ships against 1 armed freighter and 1 unarmed transport carrying 4,000 Lorathi colonists, including 1,200 children. Marcus Webb had turned his ship to face the pirates and opened a channel to the colony ship and told them to run. And when the Lorathi captain protested that they could not leave him alone against 6 ships, Marcus had laughed and said that he would be fine and that humans were too stubborn to die on an empty stomach. He fought for 47 minutes, long enough for the colony ship to reach the safety of a patrolled lane, and his ship was found 2 days later drifting in the dark with its engines cold and its hull torn open in 11 places. Marcus Webb had survived because of course he had survived because humans were exactly as stubborn as they claimed to be. And when the rescue team pulled him from the wreckage, he was unconscious and bleeding from wounds that would have killed most species twice over, but he was alive, and his hand was still on the firing controls. Chithel finished reading and closed the file and looked at the chamber, and said one thing in their quiet clicking voice. "This is what you voted to throw away." The silence that followed was the loudest sound the conclave had ever heard. Species that had voted for expulsion 11 months ago sat in their seats and remembered every human they had ever worked beside, every doctor who had stayed late, and every engineer who had fixed what could not be fixed, and every translator who had smoothed over misunderstandings that could have become wars, and every pilot who had put themselves between danger and strangers without hesitation, and without asking for anything in return. The Velith delegation was the first to signal their support for the compact, and they did it by standing, all 12 of them rising from their seats in unison, and Chief Medical Officer Seelith stood tallest among them with Sana Reyes' data file clutched in their hands like a sacred text. The Dren delegation stood next, and then the Makhati, and then the smaller species began rising one by one, and then in groups, and then in waves. And the sound of it was like a tide coming in, the rustle and shuffle and click of dozens, and then hundreds of beings getting to their feet. Even some of the Thyresi stood, not the elders and not the loyalists, but the younger delegates from outlying worlds who had grown tired of their own hegemony's rigidity, and who saw in the Ethira Compact something they had never dared to want, a galaxy where power was earned rather than inherited. Vorithek watched his coalition crumble, and he did not move and he did not speak because there was nothing left to say. The math was done, and the numbers were not on his side, and he was old enough to know when a battle was over. The vote was called. 281 in favor of the Ethira Compact. 31 against. 0 abstentions. It was done. Earth rejoined the Galactic Accord not as a provisional member assigned to the lowest tier of the chamber, but as a founding signatory of a new order. And as the vote total flashed on the display above the chamber floor, Renata Ochoa allowed herself one small breath, one moment of feeling the weight lift from her shoulders, before she straightened her back and began the work of building what came next. In the days that followed, the Thyresi hegemony fractured as 7 of its member worlds formally broke away to join the compact as independent signatories, and Vorithek retired to his homeworld and was not heard from again, and the galaxy began the slow and difficult and necessary work of becoming something better than it had been. Dr. Sana Reyes returned to Keth 4 with a team of 12 human doctors and a new treatment for the fungal plague that she had developed during the exile, and within a month the breeding wards were full again, and Seelith stood beside her and watched the eggs grow strong and said, "Welcome home," in a voice that shook. Tomás Herrera went back to Nimbus Deep and walked into the processor room and listened and heard the cascade building in Deck 7, exactly the way he had always heard it, and he fixed it in 20 minutes, and then he began training a new engineering team. And this time, he taught them not just the procedures but the art of listening, and some of them were not human, but they learned anyway because good teaching crosses every boundary. Priya Bakshi was appointed as the first human representative to the Interspecies Advocacy Council, and she accepted the position with the same quiet smile she had worn when she handed her data file to Chithel, the smile of someone who had always known that the truth would find its way to where it needed to go. On the observation deck of Ethira Prime, Renata Ochoa stood in the soft glow of distant stars and watched ships move through the dark, human cruisers flying beside Velith medical frigates and Lorathi transports and Dren cargo haulers, all of them sharing the same lanes and the same sky. Dr. Kalen Mwangi found her there and stood beside her and watched the ships with her, and after a while he asked her if she thought it would last, this fragile new thing they had built from the ashes of rejection. Renata watched a Velith medical frigate adjust its course to fly in formation with a human escort, and she thought about the scientists who had cried when they learned they were not alone, and she thought about Marcus Webb laughing in the face of 6 pirate ships, and she thought about Sana sleeping on the floor of a medical ward to save eggs that were not her own, and she thought about Tomás listening to machines the way other people listen to music. And she thought about Priya smiling as she handed over 1.4 million reasons to believe. "It does not have to last forever," she said, and her voice was quiet and warm and carried the weight of everything humanity had endured and everything humanity had chosen to become. It just has to last long enough for them to forget they were ever afraid of us. Below them the galaxy turned and the ships flew on, and somewhere in the vast and endless dark, a species that had once been thrown away was building bridges again, the way they always had, the way they always would, with open hands and stubborn hearts and the unshakable belief that no door stays closed forever.